Hey there YouTube, Brenda Petrella here, and welcome to part 2 of my Milky Way series. If you missed part 1, make sure you check it out. In that video, I go over how to plan for a Milky Way photo, and I give you a step-by-step guide on how to use the PhotoPills app. In today's video, we are going to talk about how to prepare before you go out to do a whole night of night sky photography. So we're going to talk about gear, accessories, chat a little bit about safety, and then I'm going to give you my personal tips and tricks to make sure that I'm going to have a successful night of photography. So the first thing I recommend having before you get started in Milky Way photography is a DSLR camera. And you don't need a super fancy camera either. The one that I started with was this Nikon D5500, which is just a crop sensor camera. It's a 24 megapixel camera and it does just fine for night sky photography, and often I will use it as my backup camera doing time lapses while I'm shooting the night sky on my full frame camera. In order to capture the light of the Milky Way, we're going to need to use very high ISO settings. And typically this is around ISO 1600 to 6400, depending on the camera. So be sure to choose a camera that can handle these high ISOs without introducing a lot of noise to your image. So the second thing that we're going to talk about is what kind of a lens to use for Milky Way photos. So first of all, it's ideal to have a wide angle lens. The second thing you're going to need is what's called a fast lens. And really all that means is a lens with a very low aperture number. So choose a lens that is f2.8 or below. So the first lens that I invested in was this Rokinon 14 millimeter. It's a fixed prime lens, manual focus, and it's at f2.8. And I still use this for my astrophotography. It's a very economical lens, and I'm going to put links to all the stuff that I recommend in the description below, so make sure you check it out. It takes some excellent Milky Way photos. So the second lens that I am currently using for astrophotography is a Nikon 24 millimeter. It's also a fixed prime lens, and it's f1.8. Even though this isn't quite as wide as the 14 millimeter lens, I have a wider aperture, allowing me to lower my ISO settings and get a little bit of a cleaner image, and I do see a difference between the two. So a third piece of must-have gear for Milky Way photography is a sturdy tripod, because you're going to be doing some very long exposures on the order of 15 to 30 seconds. You really want to minimize any kind of potential camera shake or vibration that might get introduced even from a gentle breeze. The one that I'm using right now is the Gitzo GT2531. I find it to be plenty heavy for my purposes, and I am also using the Really Right Stuff BH40 ball head. So if you can't invest in a super sturdy, heavy tripod right now, that's okay, because most tripods come with this little hook on the bottom. And so you can just hang your camera bag off of it, or if you bring like a little cinch sack and fill it with rocks or dirt, this could be a simple way to add some weight to your tripod and keep it steady. So now let's talk about accessories. The first thing I recommend are extra charged batteries. Astrophotography takes up a ton of batteries, and the reason is because we are using these super long shutter speeds. So I always bring 3, 4, 5 extra batteries depending on how long I think I'm going to be out. Another thing you can do is to just use a camera grip. This is doubling the capacity of your battery life on your camera by providing a second battery. The next thing I recommend is using a shutter release cable. And the one that I'm using right now is the Velo FreeWave Plus. I like it because it's wirelessly triggered by this little remote. I can trigger my camera from afar. And all this does is it just mounts to your hot shoe on the top of your camera, and it plugs into the side here, and now you can remote trigger. Now, if you can't invest in a shutter release, that's okay. The other option is to just use the timer function on your camera and set it to 2 or 4 seconds, so that after you've pressed the shutter button, the camera waits a moment and then takes the picture. So the other accessory that I really think is essential for night sky photography is a light source of some sort. Now, you might prefer using a flashlight, but I really recommend getting a headlamp. And the reason for that is because when you have a flashlight, you have to hold it somehow, and I often need both of my hands. So I just use a headlamp, and I find that to be very convenient. I recommend getting a dual mode headlamp, which means it can both be that white light. It has the other option of just being a red light. And the reason for this is because using the red light is going to help preserve your night vision. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in my tips and tricks. Okay, and the last little accessory that is totally not necessary, but I think makes your life a lot easier once you're out doing night sky photography, is a little packable camp chair. You can use any kind of camp chair, but something lightweight that you can carry in with you, because you are going to be out there for hours and hours. You might not want to be sitting out on the cold ground. So before I go into sharing with you my tips and tricks, I wanted to talk just a little bit about safety. So before you go out to do night sky photography, it's always a best practice to tell somebody where you're going and when you think you might be home. You know, if something should go wrong and people need to go try to find you, it's just a good safety measure to have a trail map or a hiking plan sort of predetermined ahead of time, and that somebody knows what that is, or at least leave it out on your counter at home. Another thing is to make sure you bring a map and a compass with you, just in case you get lost on trail or something like that. If you haven't done a lot of hiking at night, trails look a lot different at night than they do during the day, and so it can be pretty easy to get confused while you're out hiking. And similar to that, it's also good to go out and scout the location during the daytime, especially if it's a trail or a location that you haven't been to before or you're not that familiar with, because you might find that there are some tricky areas that you might need some extra gear to get around. So for instance, maybe you would need to have some hiking poles for some steep sections, and also just to make note of where your footing might be tricky, or you might be close to a cliff, so that you're aware of that while you're hiking at night. And then in a more practical sense, if you live in an area where you have mosquitoes that come out at night, make sure you bring some bug repellent or tick repellent if you live in an area that may have ticks. Or if you live in an area that has bears, you might need to bring some bear repellent or wear a bear bell on your pack so that animals in the area know that you're there. And then lastly, you know, make sure you bring layers, even in the summertime, because when you're sitting outside all night, it can get kind of chilly as you're not moving once you get to a location. So I always bring with me a light down layer, a little pair of gloves and hat, just in case I get chilly. And I also always bring rain gear, even if the forecast isn't calling for rain, because in the summer months often dew falls and you'll get wet from the dew. Okay, on to tips and tricks. So the first tip is to make sure that you've removed all filters off of your lenses that you're going to be using for your night sky photography. This includes UV haze filters. And the reason for that is that extra glass can distort the image just enough to make those stars not crystal clear and sharp. So my next tip is to focus your lens at infinity before you go out and to do night sky photography. You can focus at infinity at night. There are tricks to doing that, and I'll share that in my next video, but it is a lot easier to do it in the daytime before you head out. And you don't want to just look at your focus ring and set it to infinity that way. You want to actually focus on something off in the distance and use autofocus to focus on that point. The next thing you do is then switch your lens to manual focus to lock the focus ring on that point. And then you take a piece of gaffer tape, and if you don't know what gaffer tape is, it's just this very sticky tape that does not leave a residue, and so it's safe to use on camera equipment. So then I just take a little piece of gaffer tape and tape it over my focus ring so that I cannot inadvertently change the focus once it's been set on infinity. And then I don't use that lens for the rest of the day until I go out to do night sky photography. The other way is to use live view, and that's more my preferred method. So I just switch the camera into live view, I zoom in, and then I manually focus it and tape the ring. So another tip is, when you're doing Milky Way photography, you have to think about this. We're going to be pointing our cameras up at the sky. And if you're living in a somewhat humid or moist area, you're gonna get dew formation on your lens. And that's gonna completely ruin your night sky photography. So the way to prevent dew formation is to keep the lens warm. And there are a number of different ways of doing this. My preferred method is actually just to use hand warmers. I just attach it with a simple rubber band, like so. That provides enough heat to the lens to prevent any condensation from forming on the end of your lens while it's pointing up at the sky. Now you can get fancier things to do the same exact job as this hand warmer. So they do make these things called lens muffs that are basically like a USB powered heater. I haven't invested in those because I find this method works just as well. And then the other thing I like to do is to use this rain cover, which you've probably heard me talk about in my other video, which is how to protect your gear in bad weather. This does a really good job of protecting your camera and your tripod and everything from the dew that will form overnight when you're doing night sky photography. Okay, so my final tips are going to be all about how to protect your night vision when you're doing astrophotography. When I was first starting to do night sky photography, that was one of the things that bugged me the most, was that anytime I was fiddling with my camera or whatever, I would just completely lose my night vision and I'd have to wait for my eyes to adjust, and I got frustrated with that. And so here are my tips to avoid that. Tip number one is to simply turn down the monitor brightness on your LCD display. And if you don't know how to do that, check your manual. It's going to be a menu item, and it's a very simple, just turn down your camera's monitor before you go out to do night sky photography. Thing number two is that most cameras have things that light up on them. I have a bright light in the front. I have a little green light in the back. My shutter release cable also has a light, and my little remote has a light. Once your eyes are adjusted to the dark, they will sort of blind you a little bit. And so what I do is I use some gaffer tape and I just cover up all of these blinking lights. Now, I don't know about you, but I would never hike with this giant roll of tape. So what I do instead is I take an old ID card or old credit card and I just wrap the tape around the card, and then I can just have this in my pocket in case I need it. And that's not just going to preserve your night vision, it's also going to be courteous to anyone else that you're doing photography with, so that your blinking lights aren't messing up their night sky photos. Okay, so my last trick, and possibly my favorite night sky photography trick, is to use a red transparency adhesive on the back of my LCD display. So even though I talked about how turning down your monitor will help preserve your night vision, it will still ruin it a little bit. And so the trick that I found is to just take this red transparency and cut it up into these little squares that will fit on the back of my LCD display. And then after I've gone out and I've composed my image and I've taken a couple of test shots and I know that the composition and the exposure are good, then I just peel off the little backing and I apply this to my LCD display. And this allows me to still be able to look at my LCD display if I need to make minor adjustments here and there without ruining my night vision. So the reason why this works is because in our eyes we have these photoreceptor cells that are more or less sensitive to different wavelengths of light. And the receptor cells that allow us to be able to have some night vision are less sensitive to red light than other wavelengths of light. If you want to learn a little bit more about how that works, you can check out my Improved Photography article, I'll link it below, where I go into a little bit more detail about how those photoreceptor cells work in preserving night vision and why using a red transparency would help with that. Now, it's not for everybody because you might want to be checking your RGB histogram, and if you do, you're not going to be able to see the red histogram, obviously, because you'll be blocking it with the transparency. Okay, so that's it. If you have any tips and tricks of your own and you'd like to share them, please drop them in the comments below. I read all of them and I really like engaging with you guys, so thanks for all the messages. In the next video, which will come out in a few weeks once we have the next new moon, fingers crossed for some clear weather, I'm going to take you out with me and we're going to do some Milky Way photography together. And in that video, we will go into depth on settings to use and how to do Milky Way time-lapse photography. If you haven't yet subscribed, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And until then, I'll be doing some more woozling and adventuring around Vermont, so stay tuned for the next video. Thanks.